Hi everyone, it's Sandra and this is Peekaboo. So today I'm going to be talking to you about some of the pros and cons, both in terms of worm health, but also in terms of what comes out the other end, your vermicompost health, of using coconut coir. It was probably just over 10 days ago that I gave Peekaboo some coconut coir in preparation for an extended absence. And I will link that previous video in the description. Let me just get this tub out of the way. There's usually little worms in there, so I'll just invert it and I will put it back at the end because there's always these little guys crawling around in the moisture of these inverted bins. I've got a safe spot right next door for it. Okay, so as I go through this material, and this isn't the end where I gave the coconut coir, I'll get to that when I get into the feeding zone on the other side. Just got some funny stuff that the worms have brought up. I thought that was duct tape, but actually it's just a paper byproduct. So as you know, coconut coir is a byproduct of the coconut industry, and it's like the fibrous husks of coconuts. I see a lot of worm farmers use it in their systems, so I thought I would look into the research to see what it says. I normally don't use coconut coir, but I'll just put an image on the screen here. I have a big tub of it outside that I'm trying to get rid of because I need the tub to transport my castings to our new place. So I'm looking for ways to use up the coconut coir, and I also thought, well, maybe it'll help out my worms. And so I also wanted to look into the research to see what it said. Now, a lot of people feel that, coconut husks are a good option for bedding because of their sustainability, as opposed to using another very fibrous material like peat. Both of these materials are very bulky and costly to ship around. Coconuts, as far as I know, are not grown locally here in Western Canada. And although we do have beautiful peat bogs in British Columbia, I believe our peat all comes from Alberta. So in terms of the carbon footprint, I don't actually like either of them as a source, but take it from a couple of my Alberta worm farmer friends who say that Alberta has thousands and thousands of feet of depth in peat moss, and the oil industry can't get rid of it. So they challenge the idea that peat moss is not sustainable. But anyway, let me get back to what I found about coconut coir specifically. Some of the other things that the research mentioned about benefits of coconut coir in terms of its attributes are, as we know, it's really great for water retention and for providing some structure to the resulting vermicompost. I'm going to be going through first the pros that I found in the research of the use of coconut coir in vermicomposting, and then I'm going to give you some of the cons, some of the disadvantages, or maybe let's call them red flags about using coconut coir before I give you my takeaways. I'll tell you, if you want to add great structure to your bin, look at those hydrangea heads and the beautiful airy structure that they provided. You've got dead or dying hydrangea. Wow, do they ever make a nice addition to this worm bin. So in terms of pros, as I mentioned, probably the best thing that coconut coir is noted for is its moisture retention. It can actually retain up to 10 times its weight in water, creating a moisture level that worms really enjoy. Although all moisture sinks, even in coconut coir, the moisture retentive properties of coconut coir means the moisture is more evenly distributed in a coconut coir bedding than it might be in another bin where the moisture would tend to gravitate towards the bottom. This provides protection against dehydration in those of you with hot, dry climates in the summer. I'm just finding some of those chicken bones that I put in after going through my Instapot, and they are still crumbling easily. So another thing mentioned in the research is that coconut coir has a fibrous, loose structure that provides ample air pockets, which ensures good aeration. As you know, this is vital for worms because they require oxygen for respiration in a moist environment. This loose structure allows worms to move freely through the material. burrowing easily to find food sources and prospective partners. In addition, another benefit is most coconut coir is a neutral pH, around 5.5 to 6.8, and that also is well suited for vermicomposting, especially with red wigglers, who thrive in a pH range of about 6 to 8. This provides less stress than a bedding like pine shavings, something that I've also mentioned in the research, that has a pH much lower than that, more acidic, that introduces stress and can actually harm the worms. And it's funny with me going through all these chunky bits for me to mention that another benefit of coconut coir is that it's non-abrasive to the worms as they move through it. That prevents the worms from getting unnecessarily injured, especially as I toss it around in here, providing a nice, comfortable habitat for the worms. You can see this on the top here. These are the remnants of the coconut coir that I added last time. Now, all of the research noted that coconut coir must be properly rinsed. I'm getting into the feeding zone here, and we can see all the worms in those layers that I created. And look at the bright orange geranium stems. Wow, did they ever color up after being in the bin? Okay, so the research notes that properly prepared, properly rinsed, coconut coir is generally non-toxic, and I'll be getting into that much more a bit later. Another aspect of environmental sustainability is what else are we going to do with these materials? I mean, look at these shrimp shells that I'm just uncovering here. So those of us who are trying to do an eco-friendly way of vermicomposting, we also want to use waste that might otherwise go into landfills or certainly out with our garbage. And, by using coconut coir in vermicomposting, we are preventing it from becoming a waste resource and actually using it for some benefit. So one of the advantages of coconut coir in terms of the vermicompost itself is it has an enhanced decomposition. So as long as we recognize that coconut coir itself is very low in nutrients, it does actually provide a very carbon-rich bedding that balances the nitrogen-heavy food scraps that we add to our bins. If we can maintain a carbon-to-nitrogen ratio of approximately 30-1, that supports the microbial activity that worms rely on. Now, some of the research I looked at said that one way to get a good carbon-to-nitrogen ratio using coconut coir is to mix it with, one of the other recognized worm beddings like cow manure. And if you mix it like 20% coconut coir to 80% cow manure, you get actually a very ideal environment for worm composting. So another benefit of coconut coir is, although I mentioned it's very slow to decompose, the actual nutrients of the vermicompost produced by coconut coir is actually very rich in the NPK, well, certainly as rich as any other vermicompost. And that includes things like calcium, magnesium, and iron, especially if coconut coir is not the only source of other bedding, but you use other natural materials like leaves or manure. Coconut coir, when added to a worm bin and comes out in the vermicomposting, actually improves soil structure once the castings are used in your garden. It's naturally antifungal to some of the fungal diseases that also may riddle your garden, so that's a good thing. It also breaks down very consistently, resulting in a consistent product. So instead of having these lumpy castings, vermicompost that I end up with, you'd get a really nice, consistent product. So now let me talk about some of the cons to using coconut coir in vermicomposting. As I briefly mentioned, it must be properly rinsed, and not all brands of coconut coir are pre-rinsed. And even if they are, do you trust it for pre-rinsing? Because it is prone to extremely high salt content, which would be deleterious to your worms and your garden. Salt not only reduces worms' growth rate, it increases the mortality by about 25%. So rinsing is necessary. And of course, that adds both labor and time to those of us that are just trying to manage our worms. Coconut coir also naturally contains another toxic element known as phenolic compounds. And a 2023 study noted that diets heavy in these compounds for worms hinders their digestion, reduces their growth, and survival rates. So how you would mitigate that is you would pre-compost the coconut coir, or like I previously mentioned, you would amend it by mixing it with other materials like cow manure. So don't rely on it as a sole source of bedding. So another con I mentioned is that coconut coir is very low in nutritional value for worms. And, so the research said that worms in 100% coconut coir bedding, they become thinner and less active unless it's supplemented with nutrient-rich foods. Coconut coir alone will not support worms. They may survive, but they are unlikely to reproduce. And another pro that I mentioned was its moisture retention. Well, we all know, if you've tried to use coconut coir, that the moisture balance can be tricky to achieve, and too much moisture is difficult to mitigate and could lead to anaerobic conditions. So another drawback to using coconut coir that I've heard other worm farmers mentioned is that because it's so slow to decompose, when they sift their castings and they think they have a finished product, they can still see the fibers of the coconut coir in the castings. If you are a casting seller, that may be something that you'd want to consider. Final negative is the cost and availability. As I'd mentioned, very few of us live in an area where this would be a local product. So that means there's going to be shipping costs as well as cost to purchase. And with so many freely available sources of carbon for our worms, it's something that at least I, as a worm farmer, would not consider paying for something when I can get free natural sources. So my takeaway is that although coconut coir has benefits in terms of moisture retention, aeration, and such, the cost and ready availability of other products don't make it an attractive source for me. But I hope this video gives you some options to consider when choosing your worm bedding for your worms. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. Bye for now.